Iran's economy and military collapse. Iran has spent the last 2 weeks getting hit hard. With Operation Rising Lion, Israel took out many of its key military sites, along with crucial figures in its leadership and nuclear structures. The US followed up with Operation Midnight Hammer, using massive 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities deep underground. Now, Iran has nowhere left to run. That's according to a 4-star retired US general who says that Iran's military and economy are finished, and it may not be finished just for the time being. Iran may be done forever, and this video will explain why. First, the general and his quote. On June 24, MSNBC reporter Ana Cabrera sat down with several people to discuss the ongoing war between Israel and Iran. Among them was retired 4-star General Barry McCaffrey, who Cabrera quizzed on what Iran was hoping to achieve when it struck a US military base in Qatar as retaliation for Operation Midnight Hammer. McCaffrey's response revealed the truly desperate state Iran finds itself in right now. He says of the Qatar attack,
I think this was entirely on Iran's part an attempt to persuade their own population that they weren't deeply humiliated, they weren't subject to Israeli dominance of their airspace.
And Iran needs to give that seemingly false impression right now. Why? McCaffrey explains,
Iran is in a really desperate situation. The economy's in the tubes. They had no good military options left. They couldn't close the Persian Gulf to oil, or they would have alienated China and the Asian Rim. They have no allies. They've suffered devastating losses of their military, scientific, and political leadership.
In the space of a few sentences, McCaffrey sums up the dire position Iran now finds itself in. But is it really as bad as the 4-star general says? To answer that question, it's worth examining each of his points in full, starting with Iran's economy. In truth, Iran's economy has been in trouble long before the US and Israel conducted their strikes against the country. That's according to Modern Diplomat contributor Dr. John Calabrese, who wrote about the state of Iran's economy back in November 2024. Calabrese highlighted plenty of problems. Sanctions are a huge issue. Under the maximum pressure sanctions implemented by the Trump administration, more than 90% of Iran's $120 billion in reserve currency became inaccessible. The value of its own currency also fell off a cliff after Trump imposed secondary sanctions that knocked 60% off the value of the rial. Sharp economic contraction, per capita income decline, and rising poverty levels all resulted from these sanctions. Even now, 4 years after the end of Trump's first term, Iran's poverty rate stood at 36.1% of the population in 2023, according to macro trends. Granted, that rate is reducing. It stood at 39% in both 2022 and 2021, 42.8% in 2020, and 48.4% in 2019. But even that reduction doesn't mean much. Somebody living in poverty in Iran earns less than $5.50 per day, macro trends says. Even those earning above that level have such low incomes that their way of life would be considered poverty level in many other countries. All of this economic turmoil has also led to rampantly rising rates of inflation, according to Trading Economics. It shares a chart that shows that Iran's monthly inflation rate hasn't dropped below 30% at any point between May 2024 and May 2025. April saw it hit a peak rate of 38.9%, though May 2025 wasn't much better. Inflation was 38.7% in that month. All of this was before the June strikes conducted by Israel and the US for Iran. Those strikes will throw an economy that was already struggling into complete turmoil, perhaps even collapse. Fast forward to June and several outlets are saying that the collapse is coming. They include the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or NCRI, which points out that the 30% plus inflation rate isn't new to Iran. It's been suffering under double-digit inflation for 7 consecutive years. Much of these economic problems are due to Iran's leadership, says the NCRI. In this sense, Iran's crisis is meta-economic. The roots lie in the broader political structure, rigid macro policies, indecision, and an unwillingness to pursue fundamental reform. Policymakers lack both the tools and the authority to enact meaningful change, as critical decisions remain centralized and ideologically constrained, particularly by the regime's commitment to its nuclear program and confrontational foreign policy, it says. The result is a nation that was already in a steep decline long before the bombs and missiles fell. Now, Iran's economy is set to enter a free fall. McCaffrey's point clearly holds water here, with the Times reporter Richard Spencer also writing on June 24 that Iran's economy is at such a low point that the country's only real option now is surrender. Submitting to the US will and abandoning its nuclear program could pave the way for the ending of the sanctions that have caused such massive problems for Iran, Spencer writes. It would also unlock tens of billions of dollars for the nation, not just in frozen reserve assets, but by giving it the ability to sell its oil at a far higher price than it's currently able to sell at. Traders could return to the export markets and receive payment in US dollars, which they haven't been able to do since Iran was cut off from the SWIFT system back in 2012. Alternatively, Spencer writes, Iran could dig in its heels, insist on its assertion that membership of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty gives it the right to enrich uranium and tell the United States and its European allies to do their worst. Right now, that seems to be the Iranian plan. But that plan simply can't work. Iran is already crumbling under the weight of the sanctions that are a direct result of its insistence to maintain a nuclear program. Airstrikes against its key facilities will only add to that weight. Pressure upon pressure could be applied if Iran refuses to negotiate now that a ceasefire is in place. That ceasefire is fragile. Iran's leadership has already demonstrated a willingness to attack the US in a desperate attempt to save face. If it tries to pull the same kinds of tricks with its nuclear program negotiations, the country's faltering economy would be the most telling victim. Life for the average Iranian will get worse than it already is. That could set the stage for a rebellion that could lead to regime change in the future. But assume for a moment that the economy isn't a major issue for Iran. Its leaders live in a fantasy land where they don't have to worry about money and can instead direct all of their attention to fighting against Israel and the US with the full weight of their military might. That's of no use to Iran, which brings us to the second point McCaffrey makes. Iran has already run out of military options. There are two chief weapons at Iran's disposal for any type of conflict in which it finds itself: missiles and ground warfare equipment. The latter will be covered in a moment, but it's missiles that have proven to be Iran's main form of response to Israel and America's strikes. And there's a good reason for that. According to Danny Citrinowicz, who leads the Institute of National Security Studies Iran and Shia Axis program, Iran had around 2,000 missiles before the beginning of its war with Israel. Those missiles had a clear purpose. Iran intended to use them to batter Israel's extensive air defense, relying on sheer volume to force Israel to burn through its defensive missile supplies. That would leave gaps for Iran to exploit with future missile and drone strikes. Iran's problem here is twofold. First, it's quickly running out of the missiles upon which it relies for these kinds of strikes. And there's a sense of that from the scale of the missile strikes thus far. Iran International reports that the Israeli military says that Iran had fired fewer than 400 missiles between Operation Rising Lion and June 17th. Of those 400 missiles, sources say between 20 and 40 of them managed to break through Israel's defenses to cause impacts. Sources also say only around 600 people had been injured by Iran's missile strikes by June 17th, with around 19,000 damage to the homes and just over 2,700 people being evacuated. These are not the results a country should expect after burning through nearly a fifth of its missile stockpile. And therein lies the problem. Iran's goal is to start a war of attrition against Israel. That's according to Citrinowicz when speaking to Iran International. However, that war of attrition relies on strong missile stockpiles, and Iran is quickly running out. Iran can still have a war of attrition, but they'll have to calculate that. It'll be very hard to launch 100, 200 missiles at one time. They are under the superiority of Israel and can't use a lot of launchers as Israel will hit them, and they are also launching in hiding, he says. Citrinowicz also notes that Israel has already hit Iran's means of missile production hard, meaning it's far more difficult for the country to replace the missiles it's firing. Right now, Iran is believed to have about 1,200 missiles left. That means it can't carry out many more strikes like those seen in the days following Operation Rising Lion before it runs out. Iran without missiles is toothless. But even if Iran could manufacture more missiles at the rate it needs, it may not matter. The second issue Iran faces is that its missiles simply aren't as good as Israel's. That's according to Chatham House Associate Fellow Thomas Juneau, who writes, "Their missiles and drones are also rudimentary relative to Israel's advanced air defense capabilities." Again, faults are evident in Iran's military approach. It clearly believed that volume would be enough to dissuade Israel and the US from launching anything more than the occasional isolated airstrike. Operation Rising Lion showed that Israel was serious about a concerted aerial campaign. Iran simply didn't have the quality of missiles needed to launch an adequate response, and it's fast running out of the volume that still allows it to be a threat. Then, there's the ground war option. A fight on land is the only one that Iran would stand a chance of winning against Israel. According to Global Firepower, which ranks 145 countries based on the strength of their militaries each year, Iran has a much larger active army, with 610,000 personnel compared to Israel's 170,000. It has 115,000 fewer reserves, but makes up for that with 185,000 more paramilitary forces. Iran has more tanks, almost twice as many armored vehicles, and nearly 1,900 more units of towed artillery. And none of it matters. Israel isn't fighting a ground war against Iran, and it has no intention to start one. It has no need. Israel's far superior air force is doing all of the damage Israel needs to do. The only way the war goes to the ground is if Iran crosses multiple borders to bring that war to Israel. Iraq may allow it, though Iran's forces would face opposition from the 2,500 US troops still stationed in that country. But what about Syria or Jordan? Neither seems likely to want to show direct support to Iran by allowing its forces to march through their territory to reach Israel. And even if they did, those forces would be pelted by Israel's air force, and likely face direct opposition from the US as they marched. The point here is that Iran is set up for a ground war that's never going to come. Its only other option is its ever-depleting missile stockpile. McCaffrey is 100% right. Iran has no military options left. Nothing it tries will do any serious damage to Israel, with the few successful missiles it fires only likely to lead to retribution that causes far greater damage to Iran than Iran can cause to Israel. That leads to McCaffrey's comments about the Persian Gulf, specifically the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran partially controls. Al Jazeera calls the Strait of Hormuz the world's most critical oil choke point, as it links the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. The north region of that strait is controlled by Iran, and it has a navy that's strong enough to form a blockade that could stop oil tankers from making their way through. It's not a huge navy. Global Firepower says that Iran has 107 assets that combine for a total tonnage of 223,395. But in a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, that navy could be extremely effective. But that effectiveness comes at a high price that Iran can't afford to pay. Literally. The BBC reports that the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that around 20 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz each day. That amounts to about $600 billion of energy trade, a good chunk of which goes straight into Iran's coffers. After all, it's an oil seller itself. Given what's already known about Iran's economy, shutting down the Persian Gulf could mean Iran cripples its own ability to sell oil. Even if Iran allows its own ships to pass, nothing is stopping other nations, particularly the U.S., from setting up their own barricades that prevent those ships from reaching their destinations in response to Iran closing down the Persian Gulf. Still, Iran has that option. The main reason it's not even going to consider closing down the Strait of Hormuz is that doing so would enrage China. Right now, China is Iran's biggest oil customer. China buys around 90% of Iran's oil products, taking advantage of the Western sanctions that lower the cost of those oil products in the process. However, Iran is not the only country selling oil to China via the Persian Gulf. As the U.S. Energy Information Administration claims, about 84% of the oil that heads through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asian countries including China, Japan, South Korea, and India. China is far and away the largest buyer of the four. A staggering 47% of the seaborne oil China receives passes through the Persian Gulf, and China needs that oil. Its reserves only amount to 1.1 billion barrels, which is enough to cover China's oil needs for about 2.5 months. Think about the impact a Strait of Hormuz closer would have on China. It would suddenly lose nearly half of the seaborne oil it purchases, and Iran, one of its loose allies, would be to blame. China knows this. It's also likely directly influencing Iran to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, as Adrian Blomfield writes for The Telegraph. China, heavily dependent on oil shipments through the strait, would probably feel the impact most acutely as pressure mounts on its strategic petroleum reserves, Blomfield says. Beijing, despite its anti-US rhetoric and strong political and trade ties with Iran, is presumably using its leverage on Tehran not to take such a drastic step. Add enraging China to the economic consequences mentioned earlier. Blomfield notes that Iran made $67 billion from selling oil between March 2024 and March 2025. If that all goes away, the teetering Iranian economy collapses and Iran loses a key ally in China. Iran literally can't afford to close the Strait of Hormuz. It would be cutting off its nose to spite its face, and the damage done to Iran both domestically and geopolitically would be enough to ruin it forever. Options? What options? As McCaffrey rightly says, Iran has no direction in which it can turn to achieve anything even resembling a win in the current Middle East crisis. And while Iran faces down this complete lack of options, it's also dealing with the final problem that McCaffrey notes. It's losing key military and nuclear figures left, right, and center. Many of those figures died during Operation Rising Lion. As Sky News reported on June 16, Iran lost the chief of staff for its armed forces, Mohammad Hossein Bagheri, in the initial Israeli attack. He was Iran's second highest military commander behind Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself. Also among the dead was Hossein Salami, who led the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and has in the past warned that Iran would open the gates of hell if it were attacked by another country. Salami no longer holds the key to that gate. Others who died included the IRGC's intelligence chief, Mohammad Kazemi, along with the head of the group's emergency command, Ghulam Ali Rashid. Iran also lost nuclear scientists. Faridun Abbasi Davani, who led Iran's atomic energy organization between 2011 and 2013 and served in the country's parliament until 2024, is dead. So is Mohammad Mehdi Tehranchi, who was one of Iran's leading nuclear physicists. And to rub salt in the wounds, Israel also managed to kill Ali Shadmani on June 17th. Shadmani replaced Ghulam Ali Rashid, lasting only 4 days on the job before he was taken out. Think about what this means for Iran. As it's trying to deal with its complete lack of options, the top military minds who might have come up with some solutions are dying. These are all people who had direct lines to Khamenei and would have been trusted advisors up until their deaths. Losing several key nuclear scientists also hurts Iran. Every nuclear brain lost is one that can't contribute to Iran reviving its nuclear program so it can create a deterrent to Israeli and US aggression. Iran is stuck. As McCaffrey put it during his conversation with MSNBC, the Israelis probably would have liked the war to have gone on another week or two to go after regime targets, but essentially they had accomplished all their objectives. McCaffrey also notes that Israel may also be running out of smart munitions. But that's almost irrelevant at this point. The damage to Iran is done, and with the US entering the fray during Operation Midnight Hammer, Iran knows that its already limited options have evaporated. All that's left is to come to the negotiation table to talk about its nuclear program. The decisions Iran makes during those discussions could save the country and its current regime or doom it forever. It's not just Iran that is panicking in the wake of Israeli and US airstrikes on Iran. Vladimir Putin is just as terrified, though for very different reasons. Find out what has Russia's leader so shaken about what Israel and the US have pulled off in our video. And remember to subscribe to World News for more video commentary on the latest about the Israel-Iran war.